Somewhere in the west of Ireland, there is a patch of grass that looks like any other. Green, unremarkable, ordinary. But if you were to step on it, at least, so the old people warned, you would be brought to your knees without warning. Not by injury, not by exhaustion, but by a hunger so sudden and so total that it could kill a grown man where he stood if no one came to help him in time. The grass grew there, they said, because someone had once died in that exact spot. Starved to death, alone. Their hunger didn't leave with them. It stayed, absorbed into the earth, waiting. That is the world we are entering today. A world where catastrophe was so immense, so total, that it rewrote the folklore of an entire nation. Where the dead didn't just haunt houses, they haunted roads, fields, and the grass beneath your feet. This is the story of the Gorta Mór, a great hunger, and what it did to the soul of Ireland. Welcome back to Golden Cattle Media, where folklore, history, and legend intertwine. If you're new here, pull up a chair. We go deep on the stories that official history tends to leave behind. If that's your kind of thing, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps. Now, let's go back to Ireland, 1845. To understand what Gorta Mór did to Irish folklore, first you have to understand what Irish folklore was before it. Pre-famine, Ireland was, by any measure, one of the most folklore-rich cultures in Europe. The Irish oral tradition was ancient, dense, and deeply communal. Stories were the currency of social life. To tell a tale well, to keen for the dead with proper form, to recite a legend tied to a local hill or river, these were not merely entertainment. They were how communities understood each other, how they made moral sense of the world. The landscape itself was understood as spiritually alive. The Banshees, the fairy folk, were woven into the land. Certain hills, certain trees, certain crossroads belonged to them. You didn't disturb a fairy fort. You wouldn't build across a fairy path. The world had a moral logic to it. Respect the old ways, honor the dead, show hospitality to strangers, and the world, in return, would be navigable. The Queenia, the traditional keening of communal lamentation, gave grief its proper form. When someone died, the community gathered. The mourning was loud, ritualized, and collective. Death was not hidden, it was faced, named, and wept over. And then came the blight. In 1845, a water mold called Fear Gorta infested and swept across Europe. In most countries, it caused hardship. In Ireland, it caused something that had no real parallel in modern European history. Before the famine, Ireland's population was roughly 8 million people, one of the most densely populated places on the continent. By the time Gorta Mór was over 1 million people were dead. Another million had emigrated in the famine years alone. Ireland's population would continue to fall for decades. Some western counties lost more than a quarter of their entire population in under 10 years. But here's the thing that must be said clearly, and that the folklore we are about to discuss knew in its bones long before history named it officially. The blight was the trigger. British policy was the gun. Ireland's rural poor had been reduced through centuries of colonial land law to the total dependence on a single crop, the potato. When the blight struck, there was no fallback. And while people starved in the ditches, ships loaded with Irish grain, livestock, butter, and eggs left Irish ports under British military escort. Ireland was a net food exporter through the famine. The food existed, but it was shipped out. The British government, guided by near religious belief in laissez-faire economics, refused to sustain direct relief. Charles Edward Trevelyan, the senior civil servant administering famine response, wrote that the disaster was, in his word, a direct stroke of an all-wise providence. He welcomed population reduction. His policies, including the Gregory Clause, would strip relief from anyone holding more than a quarter acre of land, were engineered to clear the Irish peasantry from the land. Hundreds of thousands of families were evicted. Landlords tumbled their cabins, literally demolished them to prevent return. Mass graves were dug on workhouse grounds with no markers, no rights, no names. People died on the road, in the fields, in their doorways. And out of something that enormous and that deliberate, new folklore was born. The first thing Gorta Mór did to Irish folklore was, in a way, the most devastating. It created a silence. Scholars called it on Mór the Great Silence. Survivors of the famine frequently refused to speak about what they had witnessed, not out of indifference, out of trauma so profound that language broke down around it. What they had seen, neighbors dying in the roads, children swollen with hunger, mass graves dug in the dark, had no place in ordinary human speech. And so they said nothing. Their children grew up knowing almost nothing of what their families had endured. In a culture whose entire identity was built on communal storytelling and the shared transmission of memory, this silence was catastrophic in its own right. It meant that the Queenia, the formal tradition of naming and mourning, could not do its work. There were too many dead, dying too fast, in conditions too unbearable to speak of. That silence and the grief underneath it would eventually find other forms of expression, darker ones. Of all the folklore that emerged directly from the famine, few pieces are as visceral or as forensically specific as the belief in the Fear Gorta, hungry grass. The belief was this: certain patches of grass, indistinguishable from any other unmarked, ordinary looking, carried a supernatural hunger within them. If you stepped on the Fear Gorta, you would be struck without warning by overwhelming, catastrophic hunger. Not ordinary hunger, something total, something that could bring a grown person to their knees within moments and, if no food was found quickly, kill them. And where did this grass grow? Over the spots where famine victims had collapsed and died by the roadside, over unmarked mass graves, over the paths where the starving had walked down and fallen. The grass, in other words, was the landscape's memory. The earth had absorbed the death and the hunger of those who perished on it. And the hunger became contagious, transmissible to any living person who walked over it unknowingly, sometimes generations later. The remedy was practical and heartbreaking in equal measure. Carry food on your person at all times when traveling. A piece of bread, a few grains of oatmeal in your pocket. Was struck by the Fear Gorta, eat immediately. Any food. The act of eating broke the supernatural hunger. Think about what that remedy encodes. It comes from a society where carrying food at all had recently been a matter of life and death. The folklore is teaching survival. It is saying never let yourself be without food, because we once learned what that cost us. Pre-famine Ireland had landscape-based supernatural dangers, fairy forts, cursed wells, haunted crossroads. But Fear Gorta is something different. Every patch of hungry grass marks the exact spot where someone starved. The living are warned, generation after generation, of the precise places where the famine claimed lives, through folklore rather than monument, because no monuments were built. Alongside the hungry grass is its companion figure, the Fear Gorta, the hungry man. He is an emaciated, skeletal, wandering spirit, a ghost of starvation made ambulatory. He appears on roads and at doorways, begging for food or alms. He is thin beyond natural thinness. He carries the appearance of someone who died of hunger, because in the stories, he did. And he is a moral test. If you give him food or money, even if you had very little yourself, you would receive good fortune and health. If you refused him, turned him away, or mocked him, catastrophe would follow. This is a very old Irish folkloric structure, a disguised supernatural visitor who tests human generosity, who existed before the famine, but after, on Gorta Mór, it was charged with new and specific meaning. The Fear Gorta was now understood to be the ghost of a specific kind of death, famine death. Turning him away didn't just bring bad luck in the abstract. It reenacted the moral failure that had allowed the famine to happen in the first place, the failure of those with food to share it with those without. In some accounts, he was described as specifically recognizable, someone who looked like a lost neighbor, a missing family member, making the encounter almost unbearably personal. The folklore kept the moral question alive long after the event itself had passed. Were you someone who would have shared or someone who would have looked away? The workhouses, grim institutions of the last resort built under British poor law, became intensely haunted in Irish folklore almost immediately. Enormous numbers died in them, bodies were buried in mass, unmarked pits on the workhouse grounds, violating Catholic burial customs profoundly. In both Catholic tradition and the older Irish spiritual worldview, a soul without a proper burial rites was a soul in liminal, restless agony, unable to cross, unable to rest. Stories clustered around these sites almost before the bodies were cold, restless dead, wandering the grounds. Keening heard at night near the ruins, the grief of the dead reenacted for the living. Specific workhouses, such as those in Skibbereen, Westport, and Kilrush, developed their own localized ghost traditions, many of which were still being collected by Irish Folklore Commission a full century later. The workhouse ghosts weren't just haunting for haunting's sake, they were unfinished grief made supernatural. The community could not mourn these people properly when they died. The ghosts, in a sense, were not allowed the mourning to be skipped. The Banshees, the death boats, what history called coffin ships, carried emigrants across the Atlantic in conditions that were, on many vessels, catastrophic. Overcrowding, no adequate food or water, disease spreading below decks in the dark. Ships that arrived with the dead and dying became the basis for ghost ship stories on both sides of the ocean. In Irish American communities, especially, stories circulate of phantom ships seen off the coast, vessels glimpsed in the fog carrying the dead home. The ocean crossing itself, liminal, terrifying, often fatal, became mythologized as a kind of underworld journey. Ireland had already had ancient voyage tales called the Imramon, stories of heroes sailing to strange otherworldly islands. The coffin ship became a dark echo of those older voyages, not a journey to a magical isle, but an exile into grief, one for too many, an ending. When landlords evicted starving tenants, cleared estates, and profited while their tenants died, communities responded with the most ancient forms of Irish protest, the folk curse, the Malacht. These weren't mere expressions of anger, they were ritualized, formulaic, believed to carry genuine supernatural power. They were often led by women, echoing older pre-Christian traditions of female ritual authority. Specific landlords were named and cursed in verses that were preserved and passed down, and the bad ends that befell certain landlords afterwards were carefully noted, added to the record, offered as proof of efficacy. Some of these, these cursing traditions, survived in local history to this day. In a landscape where official legal recourse was non-existent and the courts existed to serve the landlord class, the curse was one of the only weapons left. The community took note of who wronged them and made sure the universe, or whatever was listening, took note too. When official medicine failed, when government relief failed, when even the church seemed powerless against mass death, people turned urgently to folk healers. Biddy, a real woman born around 1798 in County Clare, was a Banshee, a wise woman and healer whose reputation exploded during and after the famine. She became semi-legendary in her own lifetime. Stories about her multiplied rapidly in the decades after the Gorta Mór. She represents something important. When sanctioned sources of power and comfort prove useless, people reach for other ones. The famine created a desperate need for an alternative authority, for someone who could see what others couldn't, heal what medicine couldn't touch, and offer hope to those who had no official source. Her blue bottle, said to grant her second sight, became one of the most iconic objects in 19th century Irish folk legend. She was reportedly threatened by the Catholic Church, who viewed her gifts with suspicion. She was also, by most accounts, deeply beloved by the poor communities she served. The church had resources during the famine. Biddy early had her bottle, her herbs, and her knowledge. For many, she was the one who showed up. The Banshee, the supernatural one whose cry foretold death, already had a long history in Irish tradition, but the famine generated new, specific Banshee accounts that mark a distinct shift in the folklore. Before the famine, the Banshee had traditionally been attached to specific noble families. She mourned particular bloodlines. Her cry was personal, individual, intimate. After Gorta Mór, something changed. Famine-era accounts began associating the Banshee with entire townlands and parishes because the death was no longer individual. It was collective, indiscriminate. It swept through whole communities without preference or reason. New accounts described masses of Banshees keening together, a reflection in the supernatural register of a death toll too large for any single mourning voice. And some accounts described her as skeletal and starving herself. The supernatural figure of death had absorbed the appearance of the deaths she was witnessing, but folklore was doing what it had always done, finding a form for something that had none. Pre-famine Ireland already had traditions of phantom funerals, taibhse, ghostly processions seen as omens of coming death. During and after the famine, this tradition intensified dramatically. New accounts multiplied of people witnessing ghostly funeral processions on the road that had seen the real passage of famine dead. The roads themselves became haunted, particularly the routes along which bodies had been carried to mass graves or along which evicted families had walked until they could walk no further. The famine roads, those useless public works roads built as a relief, often going nowhere, constructed by starving people who died doing it, took on an eerie double meaning. Roads that led nowhere, walked by the dying, now walked by ghosts. The Taifsha vision essentially mapped the landscape of grief. The roads that appeared in those visions were real roads. The processions echoed real processions that real people had witnessed. Folklore preserved what no official record thought to note. One of the most potent and specific places of famine-era folklore grew around the Protestant missionary soup kitchens where some starving Catholics converted or appeared to convert in exchange for food. Taking the soup became a lasting folk epithet, a mark of communal shame. Descendants of those who took the soup were, in some places, still spoken of with stigma generations later. The counter-stories also emerged of people who had refused the soup and died rather than convert, elevated to something close to martyrdom status in local memory. This particular body of folklore encoded the community's understanding that the famine was not merely a natural catastrophe, it was colonial coercion. It was a religious pressure applied at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The stories preserve that understanding when official history preferred not to discuss it. Now, it is important to be honest about where history ends and folk memory reshapes itself, as it always does. Some details in famine folklore are embellished, some timelines are blurred, some cursing stories attach themselves to landlords who may or may not have met the fates described. The Banshee was, of course, not literally keying over Ireland in groups. Biddy Early's blue bottle did not literally grant second sight. But this is precisely what historians of folklore will tell you. The factual accuracy of legend is often secondary to the testimonial accuracy. What it accurately records is not always the specific event, but the emotional, moral, and political truth of how a community experienced that event. Hungry grass is not literally poisoned turf, but it is an accurate record of where people starved and died, preserved in a form that communities would actually repeat and remember. The cursing traditions didn't literally doom specific landlords, but they accurately record which landlords were considered murderous by the communities they destroyed, and that record was kept when no other form of official documentation would have preserved it. Because here's the deeper truth. The British government controlled the official record. The Irish Poor did not. What folklore preserved, the names, the crime, and suffering, the resistance, it preserved because no one else was going to. Folklore became testimony, and it outlasted a great deal of official history that sought to minimize what happened. Gorta Mór created the vast Irish diaspora, particularly in America, that would fund and politically sustain Irish independent movements for generations. It hardened Irish nationalist sentiment into something that could not be undone or bargained away. Irish American communities carried an intense anti-British feeling that shaped transatlantic politics for over a century. In Ireland itself, the immigration songs Oran Imrican became one of the defining genres of Irish folk music, songs that blended grief, rage, longing, and political resistance into something you can still hear in sessions today. Famine memorials have been built in Ireland, in North America, and Australia. The Choctaw Nations, who themselves had survived the Trail of Tears only years before, sent aid to Ireland in 1847. The act of solidarity is still commemorated. A sculpture now stands in Middleton, County Cork, connecting those two histories across nearly 2 centuries. The Fear Gorta and the Féar Gorta are still known in many parts of west of Ireland. The workhouse ghost traditions are still alive in local memory. The Irish Folklore Commission collected famine accounts well into the 20th century from people whose grandparents had lived through it. The landscape still carries it. The silences still carry it. In recent decades, scholars have returned to famine folklore with increasing seriousness, not just as a curiosity, but as a historical source material. Work by historians like Cormac O'Grada and the collection of the Irish Folklore Commission have helped establish that oral tradition preserved details, names, and events that formal records omitted entirely. The genocide debate about whether Gorta Mór meets the legal definition remains active among historians, and several countries and scholarly bodies have formally recognized it as such. The folklore has always known when it was. The Féar Gorta who comes to your door, the curse on the landlord who watched you starve, the grass that carries the dead's hunger forward into the present. These stories were not metaphors, they were testimony in the only language that was available. The writer John Mitchell in 1861 gave the verdict its most famous form, quote, "The Almighty sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine," unquote. The verdict has never been successfully overturned. And perhaps what strikes me most about all this folklore, the hungry grass, the cursed roads, the skeletal banshees, the moral test at the door, is how functional it all is. This is not decorative folklore, this is not mere ghost story. It is a society finding the tools to grieve what could not be grieved individually. You remember what no monument was built to record, to preserve the moral truth of what happened when every official mechanism had either failed them or actively worked against them. Every culture that has endured something unsurvivable has had to find a way to carry it. Ireland carried it in the story. The Fear Gorta is still out there, in the grass behind certain roads. And perhaps the instruction it carries, always have something to share because you do not know who might need it, is not the worst lesson a culture could hand down to its children. Perhaps it's one worth keeping. That is the story of Gorta Mór and what it made of Irish folklore. If this is the kind of deep dive that you come here for, please consider subscribing. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss what's coming next. A like on the video is also genuinely appreciated and helps more people find this channel. And I want to hear from you. Do you have family connections to the famine? Have you come across Féar Gorta traditions in your own research or in your family stories? Let me know in the comments. These conversations are genuinely why this channel exists. Until next time, history remembers, but folklore never forgets.